Mhm.
Welcome to the webinar. Today, we are going to be discussing climate resilience sourcing and how you can future-proof your ingredient supply chain before it's too late. Now, this is a really critical conversation to be having, and I would say pretty pertinent to now. Before I delve into the details, 51 to carbon zero, every year the world emits around 51 billion tons of greenhouse gases, and to avoid the worst climate outcomes, that number has to reach zero. And that's the challenge that defines my company's name, 51 to carbon zero. Everything our company does points towards transitioning and decarbonisation, and not for the sake measuring for the sake of measuring. And I think that's really important. And this is the reason why we are here on this webinar, to understand what it is that we can do and what is out there. Now, there's a lot that's actually happening at the moment with the things that we eat and drink. I mean, take chocolate. Cocoa hit a 50-year high of almost $13,000 a ton and then crashed back. This sounds like the crisis is over, but it isn't. In the Ivory Coast, the world's biggest producer, one farmer watched his yield fall from 300 bags a year to 50. And this year, the country cut the price paid to growers by more than half. So farmers are walking away from this crop altogether. And that's the real signal, not a price spike that corrects, but a supply base that's quietly breaking. And then if we look at what's been going on in Poland, closer to home, they had 3 nights below -4 degrees, which wiped out 90% of fruit in some of the regions, with apple productions running 60% below an already poor year. And here's the part that I think should land with any finance leader that we're talking to. Many of those growers couldn't get insured. The insurers have pulled out because the risk was simply too high to price. So when the safety net disappears, the risk doesn't. And I think this is how I wanted to frame why we should be doing what we're doing. And I wanted to introduce both Alan Hayes and Alvies Liska to this presentation and webinar. There are experts that will be talking to us on this subject. So Alan, did you want to just quickly tell us a bit about yourself?
Hello, folks. Good afternoon. Alan Hayes. I've spent my career in the entirety of the food system, agriculture, primary production, food manufacturing, right the way through to retail. I spent the last 20 plus years in the arena of climate and ESG, and probably spent 12 years working on resilience in various guises. So bringing all of that to our conversation today.
Thanks, Alan. And Alvies.
Hi, everyone. I'm Alvies Liska. I'm an independent strategy advisor focusing on climate risk and resilience challenges, with quite a bit of a focus on food and agriculture. And I'm looking forward to present a case study that my team and I have worked on this year.
Brilliant. Thank you. So, Alan, let me know when you want to go on to the next slide.
Okay, good. Well, thank you. We'll start with the first slide. How about that? Thank you very, very much. Folks, good afternoon again. Let's begin by being very clear and precise about what resilience is for food and beverage supply chains. And my pragmatic and real world definition is there at the top of the chart. Resilience. It is the capability within our supply chains to continue to function and to adapt when facing disruption. Will give us a couple of examples of the real world disruption when cocoa and fruit production in Poland and many other such examples exist. Disruption is the new norm. We are in an era of disruption, and increasing disruption is what our supply chains face. How do we function? How do we adapt within that? That's what resilience is about. So a handful of key components here. It's beyond any one business sector. It's beyond any one business even. Resilience it's a systemic thing. It is well beyond business continuity. Business continuity in most organizations is that very worthy file and set of procedures that sits on the shelf until the day when the crisis hits and you need it. And then you put it back afterwards. That's not resilience. Resilience is much more continuous and will be for as long as we're in this industry. And it implies that it's collective as well. It's a supply chain thing at a minimum. No one business can do resilience on its own. So systemic, beyond business continuity, it is a collective thing. And this is a conversation, the final line that I often have. Oh yes, we just need to hunker down and we'll bounce back. Depending on the magnitude of disruption our supply chains face, there may not be a bounce back option. Maybe it's bouncing forward to a slightly different state or configuration, way in which our supply chains work and function and operate, and the parameters within which they operate. In 2026, one of the defining characteristics also of the conversation we're having with people is that there's a far greater level of realization that it's an important topic. However, in virtually every business I talk to, it's not in anybody's job description. It doesn't belong to any individual function. In one sense, it shouldn't, but it's not in somebody's job description. It's not in their KPIs and their objectives. Who's actually looking after resilience within a given organization? Next slide, please, Will.
Okay.
And, to really bring home the point, the importance of resilience. So many, going back to this conversation, what's in people's job descriptions, their KPIs? Efficiency, margin, cash, availability, service, return on investment, return on capital, all the classic backward-looking measures of performance. Efficiency in its broader sense. They build the margins within your business, no doubt about that. And that's what has protected them historically. What's unwritten within that is the fundamental assumption that material will always be available within our supply chains to feed our manufacturing and feed our retail and feed our food service and feed our shoppers and citizens. The disruption we are seeing fundamentally challenges that assumption that materials will always be available. And resilience therefore protects your future revenue. Only then do you actually get to have future margins, when you've got your future revenue protected. And across the center of this slide, three key things to bear in mind. Volatility is permanent. It's not going to go away. Will mentioned earlier on that cocoa prices have crashed, likewise coffee, from all-time highs. That's a market mechanism at work. Pricing high or low does not necessarily indicate resilience. Pricing just indicates how a market is functioning and working. Because commercial imperative. If you're in a business where you're agreeing long-term contracts for supply with customers, or if you're a customer agreeing long-term contracts to supply with your suppliers, then both parties need to be absolutely confident that they have got a view, collective view, and have got an approach to resilience. What's the alternative? Well, the alternative, as I said on the right-hand side, you continue to manage your business blind of the actual risks themselves. And how can you mitigate blind risks? You want to protect your future revenues, then keep with us today. Next slide, please, Will. Now, to add a little bit of context for what's happening in the food and beverage industry, I want to go back to April of 2025, what was called the bombshell memo. I prefer to call it the acceptance gap. This bombshell memo was written by an anonymous group of verified senior food industry leaders, and they were scathing, in very simple terms, about what was described as critical strategic vulnerability across the sector. And that was fundamentally about its views of climate change, of its impacts, and directly relevant to the conversation we're having today about resilience. So look, three huge points that they made in this memo. First one, the cultural denial. There are significant structural and cultural barriers within the vast majority of organizations that prevent the full acceptance of the severity of disruption we're facing. Oh, it'll be all right, business as usual. We need to focus on next week, not next year or next season. It may not happen. These are all of the kind of cultural responses that we will hear in many of our organizations. Second one, disproportionate. Many businesses can point to a TCFD disclosure or a climate strategy or a net zero for 2050 or some such commitment, completely out of proportion to the actual actions that need to be taken if you really want to deal with the projected threats and the disruption. And then there's the misdirection trap, which is widespread. Organizations waiting for policy changes, and at the same time, let's push resilience down the supply chain. Let's keep pushing it down, right back to that poor cocoa farmer who's seen his yield sort of drop by a factor of 75, 80% due to climate impacts. How can he do anything about resilience if all that's happening is the pressure being pushed down the supply chain to him? So the industry isn't in a great place to accept what it needs to do to deal with resilience, perhaps would be my assertion from here. Next slide, please, Will. But let's delve into recent industry responses and specific examples. And they cover a spectrum from tactical through to strategic. And this is very much about cocoa. If we look at the work that McVitie's and Pladis have done in response to not just the significant price increase in cocoa, the lack of availability, they reduced the cocoa content, taking it below the permitted legal limits for calling their products chocolate coated. Probably quite a big debate with their marketing and brand teams. However, as a business, that was their tactical response. It alleviated the short-term cost pressures. Yeah, it did. They're still reliant on volatile commodity supply chains, and they are going to continue to be disrupted. So yes, it's a fix in the short term. It is tactical. It keeps them in the game, and it keeps their brands on shelves, keeps their manufacturing running, keeps their supply chains running. It's tactical. It's shorter term. Good for what it is. At the other end of the spectrum, the much more strategic approach, an example of this is Planet A Foods. And in a news article I've been reading the last few days, you can see what Planet A and others are doing with Cargill and Barry Callebaut and with Nestle and with Mars. Cocoa alternatives become a huge game, whether it's based on oat and sunflower that Planet A Foods are delivering. Barry Callebaut are working with recycling the seeds of grapes, which is an interesting supply chain. But what's happening here, why strategic? The bottom bullet there. What they are creating is a structural decoupling from volatile commodity supply chains. That's why this is strategic. And the McVitie's example of reducing the usage of cocoa is a tactical one. Decoupling from the volatile commodity supply chains. That's a really, really impressive thing to do if you can do that at scale. Hence why the biggest confectionery businesses in the world are hugely interested in working with Planet A and a number of other cocoa alternative businesses that are on the scene. So, Will, final slide, please. So how do we within our own businesses actually approach resilience? Well, it's a four-step approach that I outline here. And the starting point is now understand what's our current capability. So how do we do that? We need to look at recent disruption and our responses. Depending on the business we're in, we may have been impacted by cocoa or coffee or gum coming from southern Sudan, or we may have been impacted by spices. We may have been impacted by the mustard seeds, which were disrupted by the Canadian wildfires a few years ago. So we should have, and will have within our businesses, numerous examples of disruption to our supply chain, to inbound logistics and raw materials, to manufacturing, disruption to service and availability. They probably won't all be in one place, so it'll require a little bit of detective work. But we can build up a picture of how we as a business or individual business have been responding to disruptive events in recent times. That gives an indication of current capability, its scope and its limitations. The second one is probably the most important point. Because every business is vulnerable to disruption in the supply of a handful of critical materials. Those critical materials will be defined mostly by geographic concentration. Secondly, by concentrated supply. And thirdly, there'll be something in your history of disruption as well. But geographic concentration, think cocoa. Either it comes from West Africa or it comes from the Caribbean. Think coffee, it comes from a handful of countries around the world. Think of guar gum coming from Sudan. It's one of two places in the world that it comes from. So geographic concentration. If you're reliant on milk from the green grassy fields in the west of England, that's also geographic concentration. You can't go and readily replace that supply if that is disrupted. So geographic concentration is usually important. Third step, now you can start to address these vulnerabilities. It'll require cross-functional mitigation, which will be tactical, and adaptation, but it will require cross-functional. This is not for the technical team or the product development team or somebody in supply chain or just for the procurement guys to write a few lines in the contract. This will need to be genuinely cross-functional, and it will change the way in which the business operates and thinks, and ultimately how it works as it deals with supply chains being disrupted. This will need to work live day to day to deliver for customers, for suppliers, to deliver for contracts. The fourth and final one, looking forward and looking ahead, and also going right back to one of my earlier comments, this needs to be a collective thing. This needs to be built and governed as a living framework, a resilience framework. That's why I've called it a framework. This isn't just a set of rules or a process or a procedure to bring out. This is a real living thing. If it's going to be collective, it's going to need to involve your customers and your suppliers and your suppliers down as many tiers as you possibly can. Because resilience done well is a connected system. It's like a shoal of fish that navigates and flows and moves and follows each other. So thank you for coming with me thus far. Will, I'll hand back to you.
Awesome. Thanks, Alan. That's great. And now what we had was Alan talking about macro, talking about the big picture, what is happening. And now we're going to bring you into more details. Now we're going to get you thinking about what those smaller producers are doing, how they are reacting. And I will now hand over to Alvise.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Alan. Absolutely, we're going from the macro to the micro. I'll be taking you down, I could say, down to the farm level. And we're going to dive deep into a climate risk assessment at the producer level. To tie this back to Alan's presentation, perhaps, this case study sheds light on an example of how the assess stage in the resilience framework that Alan previously presented can happen at the producer level. So to provide a bit more context to this project example, I was working with a large consortium of fruit producers. And the project was super interesting and unique in many ways, but there's four main points I want to make to provide full context. The first is that the client was already seeing climate change impacts, so was already sensitive and open to the topic, and importantly, had a long horizon and long-term view of the issue, specifically because the crops they were growing required a 20-year cycle, which made the analysis specific to that. On top of that, their local conditions were characterized by sharp microclimatic variations between neighboring farms due to growing areas being close together and in mountainous areas where altitude plays a major role in climatic changes. This made it so that standard resolution from climate data providers was too coarse and too high level to really differentiate risk at the valley or the farm level, making off-the-shelf analysis commercially not very useful. So ultimately, the clients needed granular data, financially precise insights, in order to really prioritize capital investment in adaptation. So we can jump onto the next slides, where I'll briefly walk through what we did to really fulfill these requirements. So to start off with, we accessed and processed climate modeling outputs, mainly CMIP6 data outputs. We selected variables, scenarios of interest, etc. Just to be on the same page, climate modeling outputs, I mean the IPCC scenario climatic variables. These are climate projections that show how the climate is set to change given a certain temperature trajectory. Once we got all of the raw data, we then analyzed the client's internal data, which consisted of over 50,000 farm-level data points with specific characteristics for each farm, as well as historical yield data. Thanks to this wealth of data and some technical climate expertise, we developed a machine learning algorithm that used historical climate data, altitude, sun exposure, other data points to convert the coarse climate modeling outputs to a 1 by 1 kilometer squared granularity, which is what we needed for the client's specific needs and local conditions. We then analyzed the client's locations to finally perform a financial impact assessment where we assessed value at risk in kilograms of yield at risk and in euros for each farm and each parcel of land. The big, I guess I want to point out to the big value adds to this methodology was the middle parts, the machine learning algorithm we developed for downscaling, because this really enabled a whole new level of analysis and specificity that's made the whole assessment much more usable for the end client. I'll jump on to the next slide to show that to put all this information together and to present it to the client and to make it usable, we created a custom web app. And you can see a quick screenshot of the main Explorer page of this tool here. You can see a main map that shows the area of interest. The squares are 1 by 1 kilometer grids, and they provide data points for all of the variables that you can see on the left-hand side. I purposely put down a lot of the variable options we created for the clients, although for the actual analysis, we prioritize the most important ones. But what I do care to highlight here is the level of detail that some of these specific variables get to. For example, on the phenology side, we created indicators like flowering day, which tries to predict based on the climate modeling outputs, the climate projections, when in the year the tree is predicted to flower based on heat accumulation in the previous months, as well as other crop-specific optimal maturation metrics to capture the probability that a specific fruit tree will produce the highest quality fruit. Another example of specificity are frost days, which was a risk we looked at into particular depth. And we were able to select variables that look at specific temperature ranges, like from -2 to -4, as well as tailored for specific time periods, like end of April to the end of May, for example. And these were tailored depending on the crop we were analyzing. I'll move on to the next slide to show how some of these indicators have been plotted over time up to 2100. This is mostly for trend checking. So the actual analysis focused on specific time periods, depending on when each farm or parcel of land had sown their seeds, and so depending on the tree's maturity stage. But here we can see how, for example, on the top left, how the flowering of trees is expected to be anticipated significantly across time. And this is a trend that has already been recorded in the last decade. From these data points, we can also see and measure the change in volatility and predictability of climate conditions, which was also a metric we use to give an indication of volatility in the future. On to the next slide is another screenshot of how the same tool we saw before can go into the kind of cell detail, the 1 by 1 grid we saw. We can double click into that, and we basically use all of this information to calculate value at risk for each risk category. We then created a kind of adaptation planner where we perform a bit of a cost-benefit analysis and a bit of a scenario planner to look at the implementation costs per hectare versus the potential for risk reduction of each action. Everything quantified in euros. And this was put against and compared to the value at risk for that specific risk in that specific area, in order to understand and prioritize what is worth investing in and when. So ultimately, the end goal of the project was to create a map of intervention priorities, farm by farm, cooperative by cooperative, whatever aggregation was needed, to understand where to invest, how much, with what expected return versus the value at risk. And this then enabled to create a series of business case for each adaptation measures. These included anti-frost measures, hail nets, ponds for irrigation, precision irrigation, and others. And also, actually, we also looked at the insurance premium and compared the cost of these against an insurance premium cost. And again, everything quantified in cold, hard cash. I'm going to go on to the next slide. And this is just a little bit of a summary of what outputs we ended with for this project and what's outcomes. Just to reiterate, we delivered a precise value at risk and at a very granular level. We performed a cost-benefit analysis of adaptation measures, and we delivered this through a live interactive web app. This enabled the clients have actionable climate risk visibility down to the farm level should they need to, and to be able to prioritize capital and develop resilience plans with their most at-risk producers. I do have another slide, which I'll just talk to super briefly. One of the adaptation measures we did consider with the client, or options we did consider, was, okay, what if I just want to change crop or change location entirely? And so we started developing, and this is a very first version of a new web app tool we developed using, again, climate modeling projection data. And I chose a quick random selection of climatic variables here on the right-hand side. And this tool is, the objective of this tool is to scan a certain area for growing suitability. So together with the client, we came up with crop profiles, selected the climatic variables and ranges ideal for that crop, and then identified a few regions to dive deeper into. Just a little quick example of one other of the outputs and outcomes from this. And this is it from me. Thank you for listening to this whole presentation.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much to both of you. Do we have any questions from anyone in the audience? I know we've got a number that have already been put into the into us. I'll start there. Alan, 10 years ago, supply chain disruption was localized. A volcano, a hurricane, a contained shock. What's changed in 2026, and why are you saying volatility is now structural rather than episodic?
Yeah, cracking question, Will. A handful of things have changed. Our supply chains globally have become more and more interconnected with each other. The supply chains across industry have become more interconnected in the first instance. Secondly, the finiteness of resources has led to an increasing level of competition. Whereas, in 2016 you had, industries competing with each other. Now you have nation states competing for access to critical resources. Third and most important, though, is the climate and extreme weather picture. Extreme weather incidents are now happening at a scale, at a frequency, at a level of unpredictability that is, that was pretty difficult to envisage even only 10 years ago. Clearly, there's been no slowdown in climate changing emission, but what we're dealing with now is the impact of emissions from years and decades past. it's quite something when an art skeptic such as Jeremy Clarkson has sat on radio this week saying that, he's been out there, he's been on the land, and climate is changing, weather is changing, and if there are two things he would love to see in farming, it's more predictable weather, and he said greater government support. Now, the more predictable weather, that isn't going to happen. Greater government support depends on what country you're in, but government can't fix this either. They're the things that have changed. It's fundamentally an interconnected place with more extreme weather, driving greater levels of disruption, and given the underlying climate emissions picture, that's only going to get worse.
Brilliant, thank you. Alvise, now you've worked with one of Italy's largest fruit producers, downscaling climate projections to 1 kilometre by 1 kilometre. Can you walk us through what that analysis actually tells a business that it didn't already know?
That's a really good question. I think these businesses know and have seen the climate changing at their own producer level. They know that the flowering date is anticipating. They know that unpredictability is increasing. They know certain risks might be increasing versus others. What they don't exactly know is how exactly are these changes going to happen, and where specifically within their region, within their valley, within their specific farm versus farm, are these risks going to unfold, and at what speed. So ultimately going to that level of detail, which for this specific case was particularly useful, but for other cases they choose different approaches, was really useful and essential for them to be able to understand, if I am about to invest in, say, an infrastructure project related to irrigation, for example, where should I focus my efforts on? Should I prioritize this side of the valley versus another? Should I prioritize this region over another? And having an analysis that really goes down to the 1 by 1 kilometer squared granularity enables them to justify, based on data, where to put their money in terms of adaptation measures. So ultimately, it's about strategic building of resilience and where and how to place this.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Alan, so we talked about cocoa in your presentation, and we actually talked about news prior. So Pladis cut cocoa content. They took a longer term reformulation route. Cargill and Voyage Foods went cocoa free. A Foods built an alternative from oats and sunflower. Which of those are genuinely strategic resilience, and which are dressed up as cost cutting?
Yeah, in my mind, Will, the strategic interventions and responses are those which actually eliminate the coupling of your business to what you know to be a volatile supply chain that is has a track record of being disrupted and will continue to be disrupted because of extreme weather impacts and climate impacts. So if you take cocoa as the example, but you could take coffee, you could take gums, you could take rice from Southeast Asia, you could take any number of different ingredients that are common in our supermarkets, in our food service outlets, in our homes, and you would find long, complex supply chains. And just reducing the usage of something, it reduces your exposure a little bit. The difficulty is that disrupted supply chains very quickly get to a point where there is no supply. And therefore, just because you use 10 or 20% less of something, it means that when you hit the no supply, your tactical approach, which is usually a cost-cutting approach, doesn't work. So strategic is about decoupling yourself from that volatile and exposed commodity supply chain. So it's definitely for me, it's the cocoa-free route, going to the other plant-based alternatives, the oats and sunflower and things like that. Look, the confectionery industry, as we know it, is probably no more than 150 years old, but the widespread use of chocolate and cocoa is only sort of a couple of decades old. So it's not as if we've had this forever and a day. We can, our industry can adapt and move on. It's a matter of willingness amongst the brand owners and the businesses themselves to make that decision and make that change.
Perfect, thank you. Alvise, once a business has the granularity of that climate data that you took us through, how do they translate it into real adaptation investments, especially when the answer might sit with the grower rather than inside their own walls?
Again, super interesting question and a bit of a challenge when going about these climate risk assessments projects and analyses. I kind of distinguish between some clients that have a direct impact and control over their producers, which was more similar to the case that I just presented, versus others that have less leverage over their supply chain, for example. And obviously, for obvious reasons, the former example has literally control or leverage over their producers, so can literally dictate, not really dictate is too harsh, but can push their producers to go in a certain direction. In some cases, I've worked with some other cooperative consortiums of fruit producers or vegetable producers, again in Italy and Europe, where they actually pooled money together to be able to invest and incentivize a certain group of producers to enact and put into place a certain mitigation measure, whether that's as simple as a hail net or whether that's a more intense irrigation system or other measure. In the case of other actors, food and ag actors in the supply chain, where there's less influence perhaps at the farm level, it's a much different story. What I typically find with this typology of client is that we provide all of the data and all of the planning for them to then come up with a plan to engage with the supply chain, and in some cases even consider procurement options where they can safeguard themselves against a certain risk more than their existing procurement. So yeah, it changes a bit depending on how much real control these clients have over their growers.
Okay. And both of you, if a CFO asks you, what's the ROI, so on resilience, what would you tell them?
Yeah, to me, well, that is straightforward. The ROI is based on the extent to which you can assure future revenues, which rely on raw materials coming from vulnerable, compromised commodity supply chains. Yeah, do you want to take the risk that your raw materials won't be there when you need them, or are you actually going to assess that risk now, plan to mitigate it, and actually have far higher levels of confidence in your future revenues, your future ability to deliver? By future could be this summer.
Okay.
Future isn't 5 years. Future is now, this year, this season.
Yeah, to add to that, I'll on a similar kind of vein of my micro focus case study example, these numbers, the kind of final euro or kilograms of yield at risk numbers that we got to with the project I just presented, they do end up at the CFO's table. And interestingly, that's kind of one of the main focuses and outputs of this, is really trying to get them to understand, look, if this adaptation measure, which costs you X thousands of euros per hectare, is applied onto these farms, you're actually avoiding a potential value at risk, which in some cases was 10x the actual cost of the adaptation measure. And this is exactly the type of reasoning that this type of assessment wants to get to, is really to understand this is about risk mitigation and ensuring you can get the same value or similar value in the future from your activities.
Great. Probably last question for both of you. Mustard seeds in 2022. So palm oil and spices stuck to 6 to 8 weeks longer in transit now. What's the resilience investment that would have protected a business from those events, and how does the cost benefit actually stack up? So we're seeing a lot of turmoil within the, I guess, transport, but within logistics.
Mhm.
How do we deal with this?
Okay, a couple of quick thoughts on that, Will. One of them is, then take the mustard seed in particular and spices more broadly. One of them is having a greater stock availability closer to home. So a nearshoring of stock, if nothing else. Secondly, is also having developed alternative products, developed reformulations. So that instead of the conversations all around the industry, oh, I didn't realize we had mustard seeds. I didn't realize they came from there. I thought they came from there. You've got planned continuities ready to go. The products have been approved, the label has been approved, the package has been approved, the technical approval has been done. So you've got places to go. You've got stock closer to home, and you've got alternatives when you no longer have the raw materials that you need. Because those things take a lot of time. Done in advance, it's much quicker to be able to respond.
Okay. Always, do you have anything to add?
Just a quick maybe addition on the procurement sides. I agree with what Alan said, and really finding procurement strategies that enable you to access the same on an alternative product, exactly as Alan said. And I've worked with a supermarket to basically look at not just climate risk, but geopolitical and supply chain disruption risk, and find procurement measures and alternatives, in some cases also technology-related innovation, to really secure and be able to continue relying on a certain ingredients essential for your business. And yeah, I find that's really interesting work.
Brilliant. Thank you. Well, thank you both for this brilliant webinar. We will be sending out the recording afterwards and following up with a follow-up document that will help anyone listening to understand what it is that they can do and how to react and how resilience can work within their supply chain. So thank you, Alan. Thank you, Alves.
Thank you, Will. Thank you, folks.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Alves. Okay, guys. Bye-bye.